Okay, welcome to ACT and Grammar video number 3. Today we're going to be taking on complex sentences. But before we do that, let's do a quick review of the type of sentences that we discussed in video number 2. Simple and compound sentences. Okay? So remember, simple sentence is just one independent clause by itself. That's why we just put that big I, right? Because it's just one independent clause by itself. An independent clause can be its own sentence. So when there's one independent clause by itself, it's a simple sentence, right? So example, there are many Spanish language schools in Guatemala, right? That's one independent clause, so it's one simple sentence by itself, okay? And then we talked about compound sentences, right? Where we took two independent clauses, right? And we brought them together with a comma and a fanboy, right? Like we have down here. Two independent clauses joined together by a comma and a fanboy. And remember, our fanboys are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Right? So those were the two kinds of sentences that we talked about last time. Simple sentences, which is one independent clause. Compound sentences, two independent clauses joined together by a comma and a fanboy. Okay, that's a quick little review. But so that leads us into the third kind of sentence that we want to talk about. Complex sentences. Complex sentences. Okay, so let's clear this away and let's take a look at the definition for complex sentences. Okay, so complex is where we start to use dependent clauses. So remember, we talked about independent clauses can be their own sentence, dependent clauses can. And so the first two kinds of sentences that we talked about, simple and compound, only used independent clauses. But complex, this is where we start to use those dependent clauses, those clauses that can't be their own sentence. Okay? So, complex sentence, yeah. A dependent clause, sorry about that. Complex sentence is when you've got a dependent clause joined with an independent clause. So to put it for our notes, it's dependent, comma, independent. Or if the independent comes first, you don't have to put the comma. Okay? So when the dependent comes first, you put a comma. If the independent clause comes first, you don't have to put a comma. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at some examples. Okay? Let's see. Okay. Although I didn't study for my quiz, right? Can that be its own sentence? Let's even just ignore the rest of this, right? Although I didn't study for my quiz. Can that be its own sentence? No, it's not a complete thought, right? We've got the although, which makes it a dependent clause. It makes it not a complete thought. So to make this a full sentence, we need to have the independent clause to go along with it. So even though, although I didn't study for my quiz, I still got a 100. So what we have here is a dependent clause, and then I still got a 100. That can be its own sentence. So that's an independent clause. So we've got, to make this complex sentence, we've got a dependent clause, although I didn't study for my quiz, right? Not a complete thought. Because if I said that, although I didn't study, you would expect me to say more, right? Although I didn't, well, what happened because you didn't study, right? Although I didn't study, dependent clause, and then we put an independent clause with it. I still got a 100, right? That's what makes this our complex sentence, right? And then you can flip it. With these, you can flip it. Here, the I still got a 100. Here, the independent clause, here it comes first. I still got a 100, even though I didn't study, right? Here, our dependent clause comes second. So you see, the dependent can come first, or the dependent clause can come second, right? It can come first, or it can come second. And it doesn't matter. The sentence will still have the same meaning. So I still got a 100, even though I didn't study for the test. Independent clause joined with a dependent clause, right? ID. And we've got ourselves a complex sentence. How about another example? since I drank spoiled milk. Dependent clause, right? Not a complete thought. Since I drank spoiled milk. That can't be its own sentence. So we've got ourselves a dependent clause here. So to make it a good sentence, we put an independent clause with it. Since I drank spoiled milk, I was throwing up all night. Right? Dependent clause. To make it a good sentence, we add an independent clause to go with it. And then the same thing here. Right? We can flip them. We can flip it. The independent clause can come first, and then we can have the dependent clause. And it still means the same thing. I was throwing up all night, right? That could be its own sentence. And if you took this away, I was throwing up all night. That could be its own sentence. That's an independent clause, right? And then we've got our dependent clause. Because I drank spoiled milk, right? That can't be its own sentence. That's our dependent clause. But this is a good complex sentence because we've got our independent plus our dependent clause, right? Make sense? So that's our third kind of sentence. We've got our simple and compound, which we talked about in video number 2. And now we've got complex sentences, which we're talking about here. Dependent clause and then independent clause to go along with it. Or the independent clause can come first. Independent, dependent, right? And that's how you make a complex sentence. So if you understood everything in this video, feel free to go ahead and take the quiz number 3 on complex sentences. If you'd like to review a little bit, watch the video again, then go ahead and take the quiz. Okay? Make sense? Good luck.